Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming over to this particular session and for giving me a little bit of time to share what's happening with the Department of Education and specifically around the area of cybersecurity. I was just in the previous session listening to some discussions going on there, a lively panel. So if you were inside of that session, I think that you probably saw some very, very good information. And I saw a specific question of somebody that someone asked. It said specifically, what is the Department of Education doing? And so I'm glad you're here because that's what this session is about, really talking about what we consider to be one of our major initiatives. Certainly as Chief Information Officer for the Department of Education, my role is twofold. First and foremost, it's to both protect our agency. We telework. And so as a result of that, technology is the medium by which we do our work. And you'll hear me talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. The flip side is that we are advocates for and we try to impart information and education towards our districts. There's a large number of districts throughout the entirety of the state. Some are very big, some are very, very small, irregardless of size. The number of students, regardless of the size of staff, or the availability of technology or not, cybersecurity and good cyber hygiene practices are one and the same, regardless of those districts. And so in this, you'll hear some of our endeavors to promote that awareness and to promote that, again, that environment of good cyber hygiene. One of the biggest things that we have done is literally think about the fact that cybersecurity is such a big monumental task that we needed one owner. We needed one person whose sole job was to be responsible for that, not just the entirety of the agency, but again, to begin to liberate thinking and to create that awareness across the entirety of the state. And the way that we did that was by hiring a Chief Information Security Officer. And so very recently, we've added him to our team. His name is Nathan Miller. And originally on this session, I didn't have him on here. We didn't know if he was going to be here by that time, but he is here. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to say and introduce to all of you our new Chief Information Security Officer, Nathan Miller. And so Nathan, if you want to take just a second and unmic and just kind of give a hello to everyone, I'm going to switch my screen over and I'll begin to control the slide deck for us.
Nathan, oh, he's good. Never mind.
There we go.
All right.
You good, Nathan?
Am I audible?
There we go. We hear you now.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, welcome, and thank you for having me. I've been in this role for about 3 weeks now. I come from the district level. I was the technology director for Toombs County Schools for 6 years. And prior to that, I started as a technology specialist at Jeff Davis County Schools. And so I've spent the bulk of my career in schools and at the district level. And so I try to bring a lot of that experience to this job. And I hope that I can use that experience, that breadth of knowledge, and the relationships that I built in that time to really be a resource for the schools in the state of Georgia. That's kind of the one thing that I want to make sure that I do.
Very good.
I know a lot of times we felt like we didn't have the resources that we needed or where to look for, and I want to make sure that I provide that. If you want to go to the next slide, Keith.
And I will, let me just give, I'm going to yield the floor back to Nathan in just a few minutes, and you'll hear him begin to kind of illustrate some of what our strategic positioning is in regard to cybersecurity. But before we do that, let me just kind of give you a high level. What is it that drives the Department of Education? And specifically, we're no different from that respect than that of an LEA, or what we call a local education agency, one of our districts, and that we have strategic planning events, strategic planning documents of 3 of which I have on the screen to show you. that really kind of drive what it is that we do. We oftentimes refer to these as our North Star. And the first of which is what we call Georgia on the Move, which is our strategic plan. And that is set forth by our state school superintendent, Richard Woods, his chief of staff, and then those of us that sit amongst what we were called to as steering. And so we gather together and we collaborate on what should be the strategic priorities of the state. And I'll tell you that those of you that have heard Superintendent Woods before, you've heard him oftentimes say this, that we are to be about the business of service and support. And that's baked into the interior of that strategic plan, is to really begin to fully understand what are the challenge points at our district level, what are the things that are important there, and then how do we calibrate the services of the Department of Education to better assist and to better support, of which right prior to the start of the pandemic, our superintendent penned a separate document that we now refer to as the Reimagining K-12. And that specifically identified about 10 strategic points, which further kind of created that granularity of specifically saying what are some things that we need to be doing now as we really encroach on what does 21st century learning look like. Some of you on this call, you may be involved in a task force that my team is really in charge of right now, where we're endeavoring to better understand from the lens of the LEA and from our districts, what does the 21st century classroom look like? What does the media center look like? What are the technologies? What are the tools that are expected and necessary in order for us to be supportive of that? One of which is certainly this big thing of cybersecurity. And then the last document that we call our ESSER document is really just something that's calibrated around the massive funding that's coming down from the federal perspective, and making sure that we have a good governance in place to ensure that we're doing good work with that, and that we give it the reverence and the stewardship necessary to ensure that money, because it's a kind of a once in a lifetime thing, that we're doing really, really good work and work that advances the causes of education, not necessarily something that is considered to be kind of retroactive, if you will. And with that, I tell you, one thing that we have all known, and those of you that have heard me talk before, you always hear me say this. There are two things that I say, and that is that technology is mission critical. Technology is baked into everything that we do in society right now. And we say it's mission critical. And the second thing that we say is that it's not ever to be taken as a contingency option. We know that it takes place in education, that it is a part of education, and therefore it needs to be required planning during the times of strategic planning. And whenever districts and schools are developing their methods for ensuring adequate education for students, it should involve technology and its use, its proper use. That, now, we've set an environment for you. We need to give you some additional information, but these things now begin to play a huge role in the way that we plan strategically within the Department of Technology Services at Godot as to how we're going to support our districts. And with that, I'm going to switch it over to Nathan and let him begin to kind of give you some kind of quantification of the way that what is the lens through which we look first. And you'll see that from that's what drives some of the decisions that we make. So Nathan?
He actually had to. He's coming back in. He was having issues hearing your audio.
Okay. All right. So, well, I'll keep on. Again, those of you that know me, you'll know that I'm not shy. I'm never accused of being a shy, introverted, or very few words. Let's start with this first slide of saying just what is it? What does the Georgia Department of Education look at? Well, we look at the fact that there's about 222 districts. Those include both our physical districts, but also our charters as well, too. And you see that number is north of 200. Whenever you begin to break that down, you see that we have well over 2,000 schools that are distributed throughout the entirety of the state, almost approaching on 2,400 schools as we talk about that. And then if you look at the number of staff members that we have. That's almost 500,000 people that run these schools and run these charters throughout the entirety of the state. Look, there's about 3,700 technology professionals that are their jobs are to support not just those 500,000 staff members, but they operate those 200 plus districts. They operate those 2,300 plus schools, of which we have about 1.8 million students. Those numbers appear to be mind-boggling, but in all actuality, they're not, because we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort coordinating services specifically with those technology staff so that we can distribute thoughts, education, pathways, and information to them so that they can in turn use those as the best way that they need to within the specific districts that they represent. And so that's just it appears as though it's a big number, but it's really not. My staff isn't that big. There's about 8 of us that really I call our senior leadership staff, of which Nathan is one. And then we have managers, and our managers have workforce. And then that's the way that we distribute the work that we do from the Department of Education. So the next thing that is really getting into some of our cybersecurity piece is that one of the key things that we pay attention to is what's the years of experience of our technology leaders. And you'll see that for those of us that have that security mindset, we know that sometimes the awareness piece and having some expertise in this particular area is the biggest and best defense. And so we pay a lot of attention to this, and specifically around the state, we look for leaders that are in their very early years of experience. And once we have identified those, we are very matter of fact about finding opportunities to provide training for them, to impart knowledge to them so that we can very aggressively and find a short-circuited way, if you will, to impart information to them specifically about the area of cybersecurity. One thing I'm sure that those of you that have heard other sessions about cybersecurity, we always say this one thing: cybersecurity is everybody's business. And education is not incubated from the remainder of the world. We're all connected together, and therefore we have to be just as aggressive. We have to be just as aware as any other vertical, education, healthcare, private sector, you name it. We're in the same boat. We have to have the same experiences, and we have to have the same level of security that we would anticipate seeing in those other areas. This is our first stop. It's really where we start to first understand exactly what we anticipate our districts will look like. And you see that if I distribute that now across the entirety of the state, you see that there's no part of Georgia that's spared. We don't have big districts that have just the lion's share of the expertise, and then we have these small districts that don't. No, you see across the entirety of the state that is distributed. We have every area that has brand new directors or directors that have been within their first 5 years of experience. We have, it's pleasant to see that the majority of many of our district leaders are in that sweet spot in the middle, the 6 to 15 years. And then we've got just a few districts that are left that really have veteran leaders that have more than 25 years of experience. And so now you see that our thinking is really beginning to better understand and get very granular and very targeted about those areas that we consider to be the highest of vulnerability in regard to that level of experience from our leaders. And so you see with that, we're beginning to identify those regions, and you'll hear us talk some about how we're planning in that particular space. The next thing that we look at is the device availability. And one thing that we've seen, the pandemic, as horrible as it was, one thing that it did do that we consider to be positive is that it certainly very much accelerated the acquisition of devices that have made their way into the hands of students, what we call our end users, to the specific point now that you see across the entirety of the state. We see now that the student to device ratio is better than 1-to-1. In all actuality, there's 100 devices available for every 80 children. So that means that every kid can have access to a device. That means that there's literally these are kids that have access to devices. There's computer labs that are available for students to work in as well too. And so you see that our districts have done a fantastic job of acquiring. And again, what you're looking at here is a state average, which means that we have some that are better than this. We have some that are not so good in this particular area. But overall, you see from a state's perspective, we've done really good. Now, that's a great point of that. Is there a downside to that? Absolutely, indeed, there is. Why did this happen? Well, this happened because we had a pandemic. Whenever we had a pandemic, we have shifted across the entirety of the state, almost the nation, if you will, in almost a 48-hour period of going straight from face-to-face classroom learning modalities to ones that were either hybrid or ones that were full emergency remote learning. And what happened there? was this mass acquisition of devices that we put into the hands of students. And again, that happened in such an abbreviated phase of time that training didn't necessarily always go with that. And certainly this idea of security awareness and this need to treat these devices with the due respect to ensure good cyber hygiene and good cyber practices, that didn't necessarily always go with those devices. And so now we've gone back, we've begun to look at this and say, this is something that we need to address. And you'll see in just a few minutes how we're attempting to do that. Next thing that happened, let me illustrate here a little bit further. You see now from we at the Department of Education annually, you'll hear us change that term in just a minute, but annually we were asking districts to provide us with information about devices, about their technology inventory locally. And it's during the collection, if you will, of the instrumentation from the 2018 to 2019 school year to fast forward to today. You see that there was almost a 10% across the entirety of the state, almost a 10% increase in the number of devices that were acquired that are now being put into the hands of our students. And again, I don't have to tell you this. I know that you are aware of this, but now, one thing that's also new is that those devices oftentimes are traveling with students into their home environment. And we're beginning to fully understand, or at least look better upon this idea of what does the current classroom look like, because that's what governs a lot of the strategic planning that we're going to implement in a way to consider what does good cyber hygiene look like. Is that good cyber hygiene in the classroom, or is that good cyber hygiene for a device that a child's taken home and they're using? So that shows you just this mass uptake of device availability across our districts and across the state. You see here that also that this is just kind of a breakdown so that you begin to see across the entirety of the state that there's really no difference, irregardless of if you're looking at our large towns versus our small or rural areas. That same inventory is really kind of averaged out across the entirety of the state. So what are we doing to kind of help in regard to this? Because a couple of things that I've pointed out is that we know that we've had some attrition of technology personnel. We've had some addition of devices. We know that those devices are being used differently and in many new ways than we ever have before. One of the other things that you'll hear me talk about in just a few minutes is bandwidth. But those really are three big position points for us that really enabled us to come and begin to kind of projectize around this idea of what do we need to do to support cyber hygiene practices within our districts and with us within the Department of Education. And so I've got about 8 blocks I'm going to rapidly talk about here and kind of give you some insight as to what we're looking at. The first of which is rapid communication. When cyber incidents happen, or when incidents in general, I should say, happen, communication and the ability to communicate rapidly is the first order of business. And so we ourselves are beginning to strategize on the fact that email is not necessarily the best medium for that, but sometimes not just instant communications or SMS or text messaging and whatnot, but secure and encrypted, and the ability to verify information in those particular channels is the first order of business. And so the very first thing that we've done is enable a rapid communication system. And so there are specific channels that exist now, specifically so that Governor Kemp, State School Superintendent Richard Woods, or myself are able to strategically pinpoint information for a geographic area or the entirety of the state. And we can do that very rapidly, and we can do that in a secure and controlled fashion with 2 individuals at this point. Number one, that is the superintendent that exists at the local level, and the second is the chief information officer. So the superintendent specifically for our governor and for our state school superintendent, the chief information officer for myself and for my team. The second of which, or I should say the next 2, the cybersecurity tools and email phish, really begins to really look in at exactly the acts of cybersecurity. The first, or before I say that, let me say that we kind of use this unwritten rule called 80-20. We anticipate that about 20% of security and the vulnerabilities exists through human capital. Other 80% happens through unsecured mediums, improperly configured infrastructure and physical plant tools and whatnot. And so the first thing that we knew we needed to do to help our districts was provide tools for awareness. And that's what those first two bullets talk about. So the cybersecurity tool and email phishing were done simply to increase awareness at our local level. The cybersecurity tool is something that happens at a very low level. It is a tool provided to enable some analyses of traffic into and out of. Now, this isn't something where somebody's standing and looking at web pages that people are viewing, and it's not something where somebody's reading somebody's email. This is much, much lower. This is down where the bad actors and the malicious events are happening, which are far below the individual practices of individuals. We're providing tools that now allow some analyses of traffic at a very, very low level in an attempt to either alert technology personnel of events that are potentially building up or possibly beginning to kind of transpire, or give them some summative information about what type of traffic that they happen to see on that network. That's the first order of business. Awareness is everything. Awareness is everything. I'll say it again. Awareness is everything. Being aware of what's happening on a network is the first act of good cyber hygiene to ensure that there's a consistent pathway to providing that these systems are shored up and provided, good experiences for the pedagogical conversations to happen. The second is really for personnel. And we know oftentimes that vulnerabilities are exposed through phishing emails or attempts for a bad actor to send an email that's got what we would call a payload or a bait on it that causes somebody to click. And oftentimes those happen in just a moment's notice, and it's just situation where people are not thinking about what's going on. So email phishing are tools that enable us to kind of help people develop practices and muscle memory of thinking about that. And so what an email phish tool does is it allows us to put a harmless email into play with an attempt to see if people are paying attention. Here's the scenario, right? Any one of us could be subjected to this, myself included. You've been at work, you've been in a classroom all day long. It was a particularly rough day. You had to stay late. You had meetings after school. You get home a few minutes late. You walk in the door. The dog's barking. The kids are playing. The television's blaring. Your spouse says, please take out the trash for me real quick. And then you see an email from Keith and you're like, oh, it's just Keith. I'll click on that. And in that 1 second of vulnerability, not thinking about that, many times that's whenever these types of events happen. So email phishing tools coupled with training is this opportunity to help increase that position of awareness. So the next piece, the technology inventory, the instrument that I showed you and talked about earlier, we're converting that now to a real-time application, specifically because our districts need to know what's there, what's in their repertoire of tools available to support education. And with that come an opportunity for us to begin to think about better ways to calibrate cybersecurity tools to best fit those. For those of you that are Microsoft districts, you're probably using some of these tools. For those of you that are Google districts, you're using some of their tools. Those are all done once you have knowledge of does your inventory look like. We now know that inventory changes so rapidly that once a year is not nearly enough. So the intent here is to provide a tool for districts to know almost within whatever a more frequent cadence is exactly what's found within the district. But switching to the next is this idea of a cybersecurity dashboard. We need to have something to measure ourselves against, not wanting to be in a state of kind of punitive analysis, if you will. Instead, what we're trying to do is provide an opportunity for certain metrics, such as a cybersecurity score, a bandwidth availability and use, technology inventory, some other things. We're going to try and calibrate this together in what we call a dashboard. It will be specifically for districts and for districts use only, so that they can begin to gauge and govern themselves. And is that expected to change? And should it be a static event? No, it won't, because one thing we know, technology changes. It's going to change in the next 24 hours. Some things are going to break, some things are going to be brand new. And so we expect this cybersecurity to be on a gradient, if you will. It's going to be a score that's going to continue to increase or decrease based on what the position and strategic planning is of that district to be able to do these. And then the next two things are really the getting to beyond that, increasing awareness, but providing opportunities for expertise for our technology workforce to be able to specifically deal with the acts of cybersecurity. And with that, we're about to embark on training. Really, we see this rolling out as early as May and June of this year. Specific personnel at both the district and school level that will include our technology workforce are going to have an opportunity to receive training designed for them on exactly what does good cybersecurity practices look like. The idea is that they're going to be able to acquire knowledge that they can take back home to their own district and begin to determine what does an incident response plan look like? What are good initiatives that we should enact inside of our district? So the idea being here, can we have a template in place that our districts can begin to build off of? And then that next piece is literally in regard to going with the very first slide that I showed you was the fact that we know that our technology leaders that are new in their career and new in their experience of technology leadership, how do they acquire both that institutional knowledge, if you will, coupled with the other of what are the industry standards and ways to approach, again, with respect and reverence of technology, how do we approach that to ensure that we are instrumenting that in good fashion within our districts that couples with our strategic plan. And so we are providing with that two things specifically that we're looking at right now is really providing an opportunity for brand new district leaders to come to the Department of Education, to have a specific time with me and with my staff so that we can talk with them about what we see across the entirety of the state. Again, we're attempting to very aggressively imbibe them with knowledge about what happens, what do we see, or the continuation of things from year to year that they need to know about. The second of which is we're beginning to develop a mentor program so that new leaders can be coupled with veteran leaders, so that whenever they have questions, which they will always have, about things like cybersecurity, but not just those topics, of being able to really entertain across the entirety of their district good practices that they may have to borrow from other districts. And then the last but not least thing is that during the early days of the pandemic, we immediately recognized that many of our districts were challenged by with the idea of providing enough bandwidth. And so it's with that working in conjunction with Governor Kemp and his office, he provided what's called gear funds to us. We use that to immediately purchase bandwidth, which we distribute throughout the entirety of the state through what we call our PeachNet bandwidth. For those of you that have familiarity with that, through the longevity of its availability, that used to be 100 megs that we provided for every school that we would aggregate up at the district level. Now we've doubled that and actually beginning to have the third iteration of that conversation about potentially even going with a third pool of bandwidth. And then for those districts that acquire even more bandwidth, we'll literally be able to distribute that on a case-by-case basis as is needed. Well, one thing that we know is that district and school leaders and our technology workforce, they need to be aware of how that bandwidth is being consumed. Again, none of these are instances where we're trying to enable technology personnel to be able to peer in at somebody's screen or read their email. That's beyond this. This is really the idea of us for able to from a global perspective, be able to shape the network, shape the bandwidth, shape the way that it's used, so that if they know that there's going to be a day of testing, they can increase the bandwidth in specific areas or diminish it in other areas. Or for the purposes of this conversation, be able to see, if you can imagine bandwidth on just a linear graph that suddenly spikes, That should be an awareness thing, right? Something's happened. Something's all of a sudden caused a huge consumption of bandwidth to occur. That could be what we call a denial of service attack. That could be a number of things. It could be, a coordinated attack by a whole, small army of malicious personnel. Well, again, awareness piece is being able to take our bandwidth now and position a graph in front of our technology and school and district leaders so that they themselves can see what's happening in regard to that. And so that last cybersecurity tool that we have is literally one of saying to our districts, hey, we're going to give you a tool that literally is going to show you your bandwidth in 5-minute increments so that you allow at any given moment of the time during the day or historically, we'll be able to look and see exactly how your PeachNet bandwidth has been consumed. And so what I'm showing with you there on the screen is, I'll say this is from a holistic approach. This is Department of Education's attack points to better enable our districts to develop good cyber hygiene, good cyber practices that enable them to provide and safeguard for the act of education, irregardless of student being both within school or being outside in another classroom, whatever that classroom may look like. We're beginning to kind of help stand up exactly what that environment looks like and have tools to look and see whenever it breaks outside of the norm. Let me check my time. Okay, I'm doing okay time-wise. I got a couple more slides I'll share with you. The first of which, hold on. I didn't realize I had bullets behind this. I'll go through that one. So we've talked about technology personnel. We've talked about some of the things that we do in regard to staff. One of the next levels of things that we're looking at, if you recall last year, we had our inaugural cybersecurity awareness campaign. This is something that we started in October, and every October from now on, you're going to see the Department of Education run this. And specifically, this is an idea of helping provide additional knowledge that is intended for the end consumer. That could be a teacher or could be a student or parent, of really things around the idea of cybersecurity awareness. You heard me say earlier that cybersecurity is everybody's business. And that is because we don't just see threats towards hardware or towards networks. Instead, we see those threats oftentimes targeted towards individuals. And so helping them be mindful of those, where those attacks are coming from, what do the attacks look like that we're beginning to see and we're measuring, is the whole idea behind this campaign. This campaign now is beginning to kind of take on a new role of beginning to think about how can we provide knowledge, how can we provide education moments to specifically our teacher workforce that they're going to be able to then carry down to students and help them literally become good, digital citizens, if you will, that also protect and their own security and are aware of the potentials of vulnerabilities and practices so that they have some awareness piece and are doing good things themselves to make sure that they are security minded in regard to whatever it is that they're participating in regard to that. And I think I've got one more slide here that I want to tell you about, is that, again, cybersecurity is a three-dimensional thing. There is that awareness piece. It's that defensive piece on the front end. There's that aggressive or offensive piece where we provide tools that kind of increase that. But the other big thing here, which is so necessary and so very important to put out, is that the technology workforce in and of itself. And now I'm not talking about just technology in education, but this could be healthcare, this could be private sector, it could be the military. One thing that we know is that we're not developing enough students in this particular area. We don't see the necessary number of students that we would hope we're going into this, matriculating into the workforce or into higher ed or into the military. We need to find opportunities to make students aware of this, to promote activities that enable them to identify that they may have an aptitude for this particular area. Nonetheless, we know that if we're going to continue to shore up our borders and provide good environments, we need to find opportunities to enable those students that want to enter into the career path. And I'm saying cybersecurity, but for those of you that are on the call, we know that this is in general just computer science. Brian Cox and myself, we spend a lot of time together talking about this, really about how do we coordinate, because while he's developing these education pathways and whatnot, I understand that I have a large volume of people with expertise in these areas. And so our thinking is in collaboration of, how do we help find the expertise and the subject matter expertise of my staff and my folks to be able to kind of impart and share that knowledge where they can. And I'll tell you one of the things that we're really excited about, that a lot of the folks, you saw Eric Toller on the call earlier. There's so many others. I'm sure I haven't seen everybody that's on the call. Things that we're endeavoring to do is specifically find pathways to enable students to first be aware that there is a cybersecurity opportunity for careers here. And then how do I get into this business if I want to? One of the first things that we've done that we're very, very excited about is really beginning to develop a pathway for those kids that are very high promise, those kids that are gifted, and those kids that show real aptitude in this area. And we've been working in conjunction with the governor's office there to specifically enable through what's called the Governor's Honors Program. Some of you may be aware of that, which is a 6-week program that happens in summertime. And it's opportunities for kids that really have just demonstrated exceptional promise in some areas to come together with peers like themselves and really begin to further hone and craft their expertise in some areas. And this, when we identified this as one of our real needs, we went straight to them. They recognized along with us that this was a critical need. And so we're anticipating that this summer may actually be the first instance where we're enabling students that show promise in this area to come together for a 6-week period so that we can help them further prepare themselves, further, again, these kids are already coming with some really, really good skills, but to further hone them so that they are able to participate in their own career path of saying, hey, cybersecurity is something that I'm very interested in. I can see myself doing this. So we're excited. And again, we're looking forward to that this summer, potentially being the first opportunity for these for kids with this caliber to come together. All right, I think I said everything in like one breath. So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to kill my slides. I think that's my last slide, other than going to questions. And so with that, let me come back to my screen over here and see if, hey, do we have specific questions? I think, by the way, that Nathan had some difficulties, some audio difficulties, and I knew at 2 o'clock that he needed to leave to head on to a different session. So with that, I'll pause and see if we've got questions. Terry, have any come in that you want me to address, or if not, I'm trying to watch the chat and the poll there as well too.
No questions as of yet, but now that you've opened it up, maybe there will be some that have come on board. So we'll give it a second or so to see if we get any questions. Just going back.
Hey, Keith. So this wasn't a specific question, but it was mentioned in the chat, and it's probably framed in the way of a question. Is a lot of districts don't have a CISO at the district level, and what can they do to move in that direction?
Hey, that's a great question. So I appreciate you kind of setting stage for that one, Brian. So the first one, that was why I wanted to introduce to you Nathan. Because again, when Nathan joined the staff, that was the very first thing that we talked about. Was I said to him, Nathan, not only do so many of our districts not have a true CISO. CISO, by the way, CISO is the abbreviation we give to a Chief Information Security Officer. Not only do so many districts not have that individual, but even if they wanted one, there's not one available, which means that this is where the state has to come in. And this is why we've been so big in that awareness campaign. The answer to that question is probably not the one that by default most folks want to hear, because obviously at the end of the day, if you can afford to have one and there's one available, that's what we want, because we know that person understands your network. They understand your needs far better than I would ever, or my staff would ever. But in absence of that, this is where we come in, where we really try to gather information, where we're beginning to better understand exactly what are the needs and what is the culture of our districts around the entirety of the state, so that we can get to that point of coordinating and helping culture that system of awareness on both the sides of ensuring that we've done a good job of shoring up the infrastructure, but also by providing channels for training and opportunities for people to practice good cyber hygiene. This is not something that's unique to Georgia. This is not something that's unique to the United States. We know that regardless of location, we're not developing enough cybersecurity specialists. And so everybody on the call, this is all of our jobs. This is something, because we work with children, we need to be ensuring that we're developing opportunities for those children of promise to be able to find their way to do this if this is something that they desire to do. And so with that, I think through time and us all collectively working together, we're going to help ourselves. But to that point, prior to that, this is where the Department of Education, we're going to cooperatively partner with you. And with that, partner is the key word. You're not going to see us put into places a contingency of compliance or regulation, but instead, as you heard me say earlier, in regard to the words of Superintendent Woods, we want to provide service. We want to support you based on what you find to be your needs inside of your district. So thank you for that question, Brian. Are there others? Brian, I might have done a good job here.
Well, I know you did a good job. Like, it was a very thorough talk. Did you touch base on GAVs and what's available for students?
Hey, thank you for that. Yeah, let me talk about that GAVS, G-A-V-S as we say it. But if I say out the name, that's our Georgia Virtual School. Georgia Virtual School is a supplemental school that is a part of the Department of Education, and it is one of the programs up under my tenure, and specifically within technology services. Amanda Williamson, who heads up that and is our state director for virtual learning, is the one that kind of coordinates that. And so specifically now, when we think about either course availability or some of these other things, Georgia Virtual School provides content in specifically some of those areas. Some of you probably know that Brian's been working with us to develop both some middle school computer science courses. We work with the CTAE folks to ensure that we provide courses that line up with some of their pathways and some of the standards by which they kind of build. And so we work and we coordinate specifically with those. And then at the end of the day, this is a program that was put in place specifically to serve our districts. And that's an opportunity for students who show promise in this or express an interest in that. And even if a district doesn't necessarily have somebody in, say, CSAP or something, we do. And so there's an opportunity for students to participate in those courses. And the beauty of that, again, is because it's a supplemental model, we're not in, Georgia Virtual School isn't in competition with the district. It works in collaboration with the district. So the student never leaves home, so to speak. They never stop being a student of their district, but instead they just come to take one course, maybe two courses, which is oftentimes the norm. We see a child one or two times and typically never see them again because they have a unique need where they say, I want to take a computer science AP or something in regard to that. And then after that, they continue on with their normal curriculum that was been, their registrar or their school counselor worked with them to ensure that they were going to experience within their local district. So thank you for that question too, Brian. That was a great one.
We also have a question from Dr. Storm Robinson, wanting to know, is there any collaboration with the Smart Cities work and planning? And thoughts of how to involve students through curricula or other learning experiences?
Well, so I'll answer by saying, so not directly to that, but I'll tell you that we're already beginning to think again. I like to say this in the most affectionate way. This is we're all to be about this business. So one thing that we all well know is that whenever we're given opportunities to work in authentic situations, the training and the practicality of that knowledge becomes a lot more reverent towards that. And so while I won't say that we're looking specifically at that, we're looking specifically about those topics and beginning to already have conversations about saying literally either can we help these foster at the local level? And if a local level can't do that, is this an opportunity where maybe the Department of Education may be able to be the coordinating agency to kind of help, again, that pathway for students to be able to participate in these? Of course, there's two pieces of every conversation in this regard. One of them is the technical practice, and then certainly one of them is the administrative practice. And you could all imagine at this particular level, there's a lot of administrative oversight that goes into these because we're bound by both state board policy, but also through legislation. And so sometimes we have to work through those. And so I'm sure a lot of people would say, those people at the state level, they work slowly. We do, but that's simply because, we have a responsibility to first and foremost be good stewards of any resources because they come from the state. They come from taxpayers. And so we need to be very reverent and be very good stewards of those. The second is that we need to be very transparent. It needs to be with the social norms and the identification of practices that are consistent with state planning and with strategic planning and whatnot. And so there's a lot of effort that goes into that. So you can imagine that conversation, as immediately as I'm sure everybody on this call thought, oh, what a great idea, of which I say, oh, that's a fantastic idea. I wish I could go out and do that today. There's a lot of strategic planning that goes into both the administrative overhead and then the technical implications associated with that. So great question. And it's definitely one of those things that we're thinking about and beginning to consider, how do we innovate towards? So I appreciate that question.
Do we have any more questions for Keith?
And I think we're kind of getting close to the end of time, aren't we, Terry?
We are.
Okay. So I'll put my email address in chat. I'm very excited to always talk about these things. I'm passionate about technology. I believe it has a purpose in education. I believe that every one of us has a responsibility to kind of help see this into the 21st century. So love to have conversations about this. Please, if you've got ideas or want to chat further, reach out to me. I'm always available. Thank you so much, everybody that was here today. I really have enjoyed kind of sharing what's happening at the Department of Education with each of you.
Also, Keith, do you happen to have a link to the slide deck that you presented on today?
So here's what I'll do. I don't, but I'll get with my administrative assistant, and I'll make sure that is part of the technology services webpage off of godot.org. And maybe Brian, there might be a better way for you to distribute that once I get that up. But if you'll all give me a little bit of time, I'll make sure that I do make that slide deck available for you. So good idea. And yeah, that's the information that I'd love to share with those of you that would like to have it.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Appreciate you all. Have a great day.